The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as 10-year-old Prince George walked quietly through the ancient corridors. His footsteps echoed softly against the stone walls that had witnessed centuries of royal history. Today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The young prince had always been observant, noticing things that others might miss, and this morning his keen eyes picked up on subtle changes in the atmosphere around the castle. As he made his way toward the library where his morning lessons would begin, George noticed one of the newer security guards standing rigidly by the main entrance. The man's posture was perfect, his uniform immaculate, but something in his expression troubled the young prince. There was a hardness in the guard's eyes, a way he looked at the staff members who passed by that made George feel uncomfortable. The guard's name was Thompson, and he had joined the Royal Protection Team just 3 months earlier. While his credentials were impressive and his background check had been thorough, George had observed behaviors that didn't sit well with him. Thompson often spoke harshly to the housekeeping staff, dismissed the concerns of junior security personnel, and carried himself with an arrogance that seemed out of place in the respectful environment of the royal household. During breakfast with his parents, Prince William and Catherine, George found himself distracted. His mother noticed his quietness immediately, as she always did. Catherine had a gift for reading her children's moods, and she gently asked if everything was all right. George hesitated for a moment, unsure how to voice his concerns about Thompson without sounding like he was simply complaining about a staff member. After breakfast, George decided to take a different route to his study room, one that would take him past the staff quarters. He had learned from his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, that a good leader always pays attention to how people are treated, especially those who might not have a strong voice of their own. As he walked through the less formal areas of the castle, he overheard fragments of conversation between two housekeepers. They were speaking in hushed tones about Thompson, expressing concern about his treatment of some of the younger staff members. One housekeeper mentioned how Thompson had been particularly harsh with Maria, a new cleaning lady who was still learning the protocols of working in a royal residence. The conversation stopped abruptly when the housekeepers noticed George approaching, but he had heard enough to confirm his own observations. Throughout his morning lessons with his tutor, George found it difficult to concentrate. His mind kept returning to what he had witnessed and overheard. His tutor, Mrs. Henderson, noticed his distraction and gently inquired if there was something on his mind. George appreciated her concern but wasn't ready to discuss the situation yet. He needed time to think about the best way to handle what he had observed. During lunch, George made a point of walking through the staff dining area, something he often did to maintain connections with the people who worked so hard to keep the royal household running smoothly. He genuinely enjoyed these interactions and had built friendly relationships with many of the staff members over the years. Today, however, he noticed that some of the usual warmth was missing from their greetings. As he approached Maria's table, he could see that she looked particularly troubled. Her usually bright smile was absent, and she seemed to be picking at her food rather than eating. George sat down beside her, something that always surprised and delighted the staff members. His natural warmth and genuine interest in people had always been one of his most endearing qualities. Maria initially seemed nervous about the young prince's attention, but George's easy manner soon put her at ease. Without directly asking about Thompson, he engaged her in conversation about her work and her family. Through their chat, he learned that she had recently moved to England from Spain and was working hard to support her 2 young children back home. The job at Windsor Castle was important to her, and she was grateful for the opportunity, but George could sense an underlying anxiety in her voice. As their conversation continued, George's understanding of the situation deepened. He realized that Maria was walking on eggshells, afraid of making any mistake that might cost her the job she desperately needed. While she didn't specifically mention Thompson by name, her references to some of the security staff being very strict painted a clear picture of what she was experiencing. The afternoon brought George's favorite activity, his riding lesson in the castle grounds. As he prepared his horse, he noticed Thompson patrolling the area. The guard's interaction with the stable hands was curt and dismissive, and George watched as Thompson criticized one of the younger grooms for something that seemed completely reasonable. The groom, clearly intimidated, simply nodded and hurried away to complete his tasks. George felt a growing sense of responsibility weighing on his shoulders. He had been taught from an early age that with privilege comes duty, and that protecting those who cannot protect themselves is one of the most important aspects of leadership. His parents had always emphasized the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of their position or status. That evening, as George sat in his room doing homework, he reflected on everything he had observed throughout the day. He knew that he couldn't simply ignore what was happening, but he also understood that he needed to handle the situation carefully and thoughtfully. The young prince was learning that sometimes the most powerful action is also the most gentle one, and that true strength often lies in showing compassion and understanding, rather than force or authority. As he prepared for bed, George made a decision about how he would approach the situation the following day. He had a plan that would require courage, wisdom, and the kind of gentle strength that his grandmother had always embodied. The next morning would bring an opportunity for the young prince to demonstrate the leadership qualities that had been carefully nurtured in him since birth. The next morning arrived with a crisp autumn breeze that rustled through the trees surrounding Windsor Castle. Prince George woke early, his mind already focused on the plan he had developed the previous evening. He dressed carefully, choosing one of his more formal outfits, not because it was required, but because he understood the importance of presentation when dealing with serious matters. After his usual morning routine, George made his way to the kitchen to speak with Mrs. Patterson, the head cook who had worked at Windsor Castle for over 20 years. Mrs. Patterson had always been like a grandmother figure to George, someone who could be trusted with sensitive matters, and who had the wisdom that comes from years of experience in the royal household. George found Mrs. Patterson preparing the morning meal for the staff, her capable hands moving efficiently as she organized the kitchen. She looked up with a warm smile when she saw the young prince, but her expression grew more serious when she noticed the determined look in his eyes. Mrs. Patterson had seen that expression before, and she knew it meant that George was grappling with something important. Without mentioning Thompson by name, George carefully explained his observations about certain staff members seeming unhappy or worried. He asked Mrs. Patterson if she had noticed anything unusual in the kitchen or among the household staff. The experienced cook paused in her work, studying the young prince's face carefully before responding. Mrs. Patterson confirmed George's suspicions without going into specific details. She explained that there had been some tension among the staff recently, particularly involving interactions with certain members of the security team. She praised George for his sensitivity in noticing these issues and for caring enough to inquire about the welfare of the people who worked in the castle. George then shared his plan with Mrs. Patterson, asking for her advice on how to proceed. He wanted to organize an informal gathering where staff members could share their experiences and concerns in a safe environment. His idea was to create an opportunity for open dialogue, where problems could be addressed constructively rather than allowed to fester in silence. Mrs. Patterson listened thoughtfully to George's proposal, impressed by the young prince's maturity and wisdom. She suggested a few modifications to make the plan even more effective, drawing on her years of experience in managing staff relations. Together, they developed a strategy that would allow for honest communication while maintaining the respect and dignity that everyone deserved. The first step in their plan was to speak with George's parents, Prince William and Catherine. George knew that any significant action involving staff members needed to be discussed with his parents first. He found them in the morning room, enjoying their coffee and reviewing the day's schedule. Both parents could immediately see that their son had something important on his mind. George carefully explained what he had observed, emphasizing his concern for the well-being of the castle staff. He described his conversations with Mrs. Patterson and outlined his proposal for addressing the situation. Prince William and Catherine listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions and discussing the implications of different approaches. Both parents were proud of George's compassion and his instinct to protect those who might be vulnerable. They recognized that this was an important learning moment for their son, an opportunity for him to develop the leadership skills he would need throughout his life. After considerable discussion, they agreed to support George's plan, with some additional safeguards to ensure that the process would be fair and constructive for everyone involved. Catherine suggested that George invite his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, to participate in the conversation, The Queen's decades of experience in managing complex situations would provide valuable perspective, and her presence would underscore the seriousness with which the family viewed the concerns that had been raised. George was thrilled by this suggestion, knowing that his grandmother's wisdom would be invaluable in navigating the delicate situation. Later that morning, George had the opportunity to speak privately with Queen Elizabeth in her sitting room. The Queen listened carefully as her grandson explained his observations and concerns, asking perceptive questions that helped George think more deeply about the complexities involved. She commended him for his awareness and his desire to help, while also teaching him about the importance of fairness and due process in addressing workplace concerns. Queen Elizabeth shared stories from her own experiences over the years, explaining how she had learned to balance compassion with responsibility when dealing with difficult personnel situations. She emphasized the importance of giving everyone involved a chance to share their perspective and working towards solutions that would benefit the entire royal household. The Queen agreed to meet with Thompson the following day, not as an adversary, but as someone seeking to understand the situation and work toward a positive resolution. She explained to George that true leadership often involves having difficult conversations with kindness and respect, even when addressing serious concerns about someone's behavior. As the day progressed, George felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement about the plan that was taking shape. He spent time walking through the castle grounds, observing the interactions between various staff members and security personnel. He made a point of greeting everyone he encountered with particular warmth, hoping to boost morale and demonstrate that the royal family cared about each person's well-being. During his afternoon lessons, George found it easier to concentrate, knowing that positive action was being taken to address the concerns he had identified. His tutor, Mrs. Henderson, noticed the change in his demeanor and commented on how focused and mature he seemed. George appreciated her observation, but kept the details of his recent activities private, understanding the importance of discretion in sensitive matters. That evening, George joined his parents for dinner, and they continued their discussion about the situation with Thompson. They talked about the importance of creating a workplace environment where everyone feels valued and respected, and how small actions by individuals in positions of authority can have far-reaching effects on the entire community. As George prepared for bed that night, he felt a sense of anticipation about the conversation that would take place the next day. He had learned valuable lessons about observation, compassion, and the courage required to address difficult situations. The young prince was beginning to understand that true strength often lies not in confrontation, but in the willingness to engage in honest dialogue with the goal of creating positive change for everyone involved. The following morning brought an air of quiet determination to Windsor Castle. Prince George rose early, spending extra time in reflection as he prepared for what he knew would be a significant day. He had learned from his grandmother that important conversations require both careful preparation and an open heart, ready to listen as much as to speak. Queen Elizabeth had arranged to meet with Thompson in her private study at 10 o'clock. The room, lined with books and family photographs, had witnessed countless important discussions over the decades. Its warm atmosphere often helped put people at ease even during difficult conversations. George would not be present for this initial meeting, but he knew that his observations and concerns would be respectfully presented. Before the meeting, George took his usual morning walk through the castle, but this time with a different purpose. He wanted to check in with some of the staff members who had seemed troubled in recent days. His first stop was the housekeeping department, where he found Maria preparing her cleaning supplies for the day's work. Maria looked surprised but pleased to see the young prince, and George could see that some of the anxiety from their previous conversation had lessened. She thanked him for taking the time to speak with her the day before, explaining that it had meant a great deal to her to know that someone cared about her experience at the castle. George was touched by her gratitude and took the opportunity to assure her that every member of the castle staff was valued and important. As George continued his rounds, he noticed that word of his interest in staff well-being had spread quietly through the household. Several people approached him to express their appreciation for his concern, and he could sense a subtle shift in the atmosphere. People seemed to stand a little straighter, smile a little more readily, and there was a feeling of hope that positive changes might be coming. At precisely 10 o'clock, Thompson arrived at Queen Elizabeth's study. He had been informed that the Queen wished to discuss his role in the Royal Protection Team and his interactions with castle staff. Thompson entered the room with his usual confident bearing, though George later learned that his grandmother had immediately noticed signs of nervousness beneath the guard's professional exterior. Queen Elizabeth began the conversation by thanking Thompson for his service and acknowledging his dedication to protecting the royal family. She explained that she made it a practice to meet regularly with staff members to ensure that everyone was settling in well and that the work environment remained positive for all. Thompson relaxed slightly, perhaps expecting a routine check-in meeting. The Queen then gently transitioned to discussing the importance of teamwork and mutual respect within the royal household. She spoke about how the castle functioned like a large family, where everyone's contribution was essential, and where treating colleagues with kindness and dignity was not just expected, but required. Thompson listened politely, though he seemed unsure where the conversation was heading. With her characteristic grace, Queen Elizabeth then shared some of the concerns that had been brought to her attention regarding interactions between security staff and other castle employees. She was careful not to make accusations, instead presenting the feedback as an opportunity for reflection and improvement. Thompson's demeanor shifted as he realized that his behavior had been noticed and was being questioned. Initially, Thompson tried to defend his actions, explaining that maintaining security required a certain level of authority, and that he was simply trying to ensure that protocols were followed properly. The Queen listened patiently to his explanation, then gently challenged him to consider whether his approach was achieving the desired results, or if it might be creating unnecessary tension and anxiety among the staff. As the conversation continued, Queen Elizabeth shared stories from her decades of experience in leadership, emphasizing how she had learned that true authority comes from earning respect rather than demanding it. She explained that effective security actually depends on the cooperation and trust of everyone in the environment, and that creating fear or resentment among staff members could actually compromise safety rather than enhance it. Thompson began to show signs of genuine reflection as the Queen's words sank in. She had a gift for helping people see situations from new perspectives without making them feel attacked or diminished. Slowly, Thompson began to acknowledge that perhaps his approach had been more heavy-handed than necessary, and that he might have misunderstood the collaborative nature of work within the royal household. The Queen then invited Thompson to share his own perspective on his role and his experiences since joining the protection team. She discovered that he had come from a military background where a more authoritarian approach was standard, and that he had perhaps struggled to adapt to the different culture of the royal household. This insight helped both of them understand the root of the problem and identify potential solutions. Throughout this conversation, George was going about his normal daily activities, but his thoughts kept returning to what might be happening in his grandmother's study. During his morning lessons, he found himself hoping that the discussion was proceeding constructively and that Thompson would be open to feedback and change. At lunchtime, George noticed that Thompson was not at his usual post, and he correctly assumed that the conversation with Queen Elizabeth was continuing. He used this opportunity to spend more time with the castle staff, particularly those who had been most affected by Thompson's harsh treatment. George wanted to ensure that everyone knew their concerns had been heard and taken seriously. The young prince also spent time thinking about the lessons he was learning through this experience. He was beginning to understand that leadership involves not just identifying problems, but also working toward solutions that benefit everyone involved. He realized that his grandmother's approach of addressing the situation with dignity and respect was far more powerful than any confrontational method could have been. As the afternoon wore on, George sensed a subtle change in the atmosphere around the castle. Staff members seemed more relaxed, and there was a quiet buzz of conversation that suggested positive news was spreading through the household. When George finally saw Thompson again later in the day, he noticed that the guard's entire demeanor had changed, and he found himself curious about what had transpired during that important conversation with his grandmother. The conversation between Queen Elizabeth and Thompson had lasted nearly 2 hours, and when it concluded, both participants emerged with a new understanding of each other and the situation. Thompson had experienced something he hadn't expected, a genuine desire to learn and grow, rather than simply being reprimanded for his mistakes. The Queen's wisdom and compassion had created an environment where real change could begin to take place. Later that afternoon, George had the opportunity to speak privately with his grandmother about the meeting. They sat together in the Queen's favorite sitting room, where afternoon light filtered through tall windows and created a warm, comfortable atmosphere for their conversation. George was eager to learn about what had transpired, but he approached the topic with the patience and respect that his grandmother had taught him. Queen Elizabeth explained that Thompson had initially been defensive about his behavior, but as their conversation progressed, he had become increasingly receptive to feedback and reflection. She described how she had helped him understand that his military background, while valuable in many ways, required some adaptation to work effectively in the collaborative environment of the royal household. The Queen told George that Thompson had ultimately expressed genuine remorse for his treatment of the castle staff and had asked for guidance on how to improve his interactions with colleagues. She had been impressed by his willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and his sincere desire to make amends. This response had convinced her that Thompson was someone who could change and grow, rather than someone who needed to be removed from his position. George listened carefully to his grandmother's account, learning valuable lessons about the importance of giving people opportunities to improve, rather than simply dismissing them when problems arise. The Queen explained that true leadership often involves helping others become better versions of themselves, even when that process requires patience and understanding. The Queen had arranged for Thompson to meet with Mrs. Patterson and several other senior staff members over the following days. These conversations would give him the opportunity to hear directly from the people he had affected with his behavior, and to begin rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by his harsh approach. The Queen believed that these face-to-face discussions would be crucial for creating lasting change. George was particularly interested to learn about Thompson's reaction to discovering that his behavior had been affecting people's well-being and job satisfaction. The Queen explained that Thompson had seemed genuinely surprised and troubled to learn that his attempts to maintain security standards had instead created anxiety and fear among the staff. This realization had been a turning point in their conversation. The following morning, George made a point of observing Thompson's interactions with the castle staff, curious to see if the previous day's conversation had resulted in any noticeable changes. He was pleasantly surprised to see Thompson approaching his duties with a markedly different demeanor. The guard's posture remained professional, but there was a new gentleness in his voice and a respect in his manner that had been absent before. George watched as Thompson encountered Maria in one of the corridors. Instead of the curt nod or critical comment that might have occurred in the past, Thompson stopped to greet her politely and even asked if she needed any assistance with the heavy cleaning equipment she was carrying. Maria looked surprised but pleased by this unexpected courtesy, and George could see her tension visibly decrease during their brief interaction. Throughout the morning, George continued to observe similar scenes playing out around the castle. Thompson was making a genuine effort to rebuild relationships with the people he had previously treated harshly. His approach was still professional and security-focused, but it was now tempered with the kind of respect and kindness that made people feel valued, rather than intimidated. During his afternoon lessons, George found himself reflecting on the transformation he was witnessing. His tutor, Mrs. Henderson, noticed his thoughtful mood and asked if anything special was happening at the castle. George shared some general observations about positive changes in staff morale, without revealing the specific details of the situation with Thompson. Mrs. Henderson was impressed by George's awareness of the people around him and his concern for their well-being. She used the opportunity to discuss leadership principles with George, explaining how great leaders throughout history had often been distinguished by their ability to inspire positive change in others through example and compassion rather than force or intimidation. Later that day, George encountered Thompson near the main entrance to the castle. For the first time since Thompson had joined the security team, the guard initiated a conversation with the young prince. Thompson thanked George for his concern about the welfare of the castle staff, explaining that the Queen had mentioned George's observations during their conversation. Thompson went on to express his appreciation for the opportunity to learn and grow in his role, rather than simply being dismissed for his mistakes. He assured George that he was committed to being not just an effective security guard, but also a positive member of the castle community. George was touched by Thompson's sincerity and impressed by his willingness to acknowledge his errors publicly. The conversation between George and Thompson marked an important moment in both of their lives. For George, it reinforced the power of compassionate leadership and the importance of speaking up when witnessing unfair treatment of others. For Thompson, it demonstrated that respect and authority could coexist, and that true strength often lies in the ability to admit mistakes and commit to improvement. As the day came to an end, George reflected on the remarkable transformation that had taken place in just a few days. What had begun with his simple observation of staff members seeming unhappy had evolved into a powerful lesson about leadership, compassion, and the possibility of positive change. He realized that his gentle approach had ultimately been far more effective than any harsh confrontation could have been, and he felt grateful for the wisdom his family had shared with him throughout the process. Over the next several weeks, the changes at Windsor Castle became increasingly evident to everyone who lived and worked there. The transformation in Thompson's behavior had created a ripple effect throughout the entire household, demonstrating how one person's willingness to change can positively influence an entire community. George continued to observe these developments with great interest, learning valuable lessons about leadership and human nature in the process. Thompson's meetings with Mrs. Patterson and other senior staff members had gone remarkably well. Mrs. Patterson later told George that she had been impressed by Thompson's humility and his genuine desire to understand how his previous behavior had affected others. The experienced cook explained that Thompson had listened carefully to feedback without becoming defensive, and had asked thoughtful questions about how he could better contribute to the positive atmosphere of the royal household. One of the most significant changes George noticed was in Thompson's relationship with Maria. The young cleaning lady who had once seemed anxious and worried now approached her work with renewed confidence and enthusiasm. George observed Thompson going out of his way to acknowledge Maria's hard work and to offer assistance when she was handling particularly challenging tasks. During one of their chance encounters in the corridor, Maria shared with George how much Thompson's changed attitude had meant to her. She explained that feeling respected and valued at work had made an enormous difference in her life, and that she now looked forward to coming to the castle each day, rather than dreading potential confrontations with security staff. George also noticed that Thompson had begun participating in some of the informal social activities that brought the castle staff together. The guard attended the monthly birthday celebrations in the staff dining room and joined conversations during break times. His colleagues in the security department had responded positively to these changes, and George could see that Thompson was developing genuine friendships rather than simply maintaining professional working relationships. The transformation extended beyond Thompson's personal relationships to his approach to security itself. George observed that Thompson had found ways to maintain the high standards required for royal protection, while treating everyone with dignity and respect. He had learned that effective security often depends on having the cooperation and trust of everyone in the environment, and that creating a positive atmosphere actually enhanced rather than compromised safety. Queen Elizabeth made a point of checking in with George regularly about the situation, using these conversations as teaching opportunities about leadership and human nature. She explained that Thompson's transformation was particularly meaningful because it demonstrated the power of approaching problems with wisdom and compassion rather than punishment and criticism. The Queen also shared with George how proud she was of his initial observations and his compassionate response to the situation. She explained that many people might have simply complained about Thompson's behavior or ignored it entirely, but George had chosen to take constructive action aimed at helping everyone involved. This approach reflected the kind of leadership qualities that would serve him well throughout his life. Prince William and Catherine had also been following the developments closely, and they used the situation as an opportunity to discuss important values with George. They talked about the responsibility that comes with privilege and position, and how true leadership involves using one's influence to protect and uplift others, especially those who might not have strong voices of their own. George's siblings, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis, had also noticed the improved atmosphere around the castle, though they were too young to understand all the details of what had transpired. George took pleasure in seeing his younger siblings interact more freely with the staff members, who seemed more relaxed and cheerful in their daily activities. The experience had also strengthened George's relationships with various members of the castle staff. People who had previously seen him as a polite young prince now viewed him as someone who genuinely cared about their well-being and who would advocate for them when necessary. This deeper level of trust and connection enriched George's daily life at the castle and provided him with valuable insights into the experiences of people from different backgrounds. Mrs. Patterson had become particularly fond of George, often seeking opportunities to share wisdom from her years of experience in managing relationships within the royal household. She taught him about the importance of consistency in leadership, explaining that people need to know they can count on fair and respectful treatment every day, not just when someone in authority is watching. Thompson himself had become one of George's most important teachers, though neither of them had initially expected this development. The guard's willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and commit to personal growth demonstrated qualities of character that George found admirable and instructive. Their conversations, while infrequent, always left George with new insights about the courage required for authentic change. As autumn progressed into winter, the positive changes that had begun with George's observations continued to strengthen and spread throughout the castle community. George realized that he had witnessed something remarkable, proof that gentle yet strong action, guided by wisdom and compassion, could create lasting positive change in people's lives. The experience had taught George that effective leadership often requires patience and persistence rather than dramatic gestures or confrontations. He had learned that taking time to understand different perspectives and working toward solutions that benefit everyone involved was far more powerful than simply trying to win arguments or impose one's will on others. George also came to understand that real strength sometimes looks different than what people might expect. The quiet courage required to speak up for others, the wisdom needed to approach conflicts with compassion, and the patience necessary to help others grow and change. These qualities represented a kind of strength that would serve him well throughout his life as a member of the royal family. As winter settled over Windsor Castle, the positive changes that had begun with George's careful observations had become a permanent part of the castle's culture. What had started as a concern about one security guard's behavior had evolved into a broader renewal of the values and practices that made the royal household such a special place to work and live. George had been invited to attend a special staff meeting that Queen Elizabeth had organized to celebrate the improvements in workplace culture and to reinforce the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. This was the first time George had been included in such a formal staff gathering, and he understood that his participation represented recognition of his role in initiating the positive changes. The meeting took place in the Grand Hall, with staff members from all departments of the castle in attendance. Queen Elizabeth began by expressing her gratitude for everyone's dedication to creating a workplace where every person felt valued and respected. She spoke about how the castle functioned best when it operated like a caring family, where differences in job titles or responsibilities never diminished the fundamental worth and dignity of each individual. Thompson was specifically recognized during the meeting for his willingness to listen to feedback and make meaningful changes in his approach to his work. The Queen acknowledged that it takes courage to examine one's own behavior and commit to improvement, and she praised Thompson for demonstrating exactly the kind of growth mindset that she valued in all members of the royal household. George watched as Thompson received warm applause from his colleagues, and he could see the genuine emotion on the guard's face as he realized how fully he had been accepted back into the castle community. This moment reinforced for George the power of forgiveness and second chances, and the importance of creating environments where people can learn from their mistakes without being permanently defined by them. Following the formal portion of the meeting, there was an informal reception where staff members could mingle and enjoy refreshments together. George spent time moving through the crowd, talking with people from different departments and learning more about their experiences at the castle. Many people took the opportunity to thank him personally for his role in addressing the workplace concerns that had been affecting morale. Maria approached George during the reception, accompanied by her supervisor and several other members of the housekeeping staff. She presented him with a small gift that she had made, a hand-embroidered handkerchief featuring the castle's coat of arms. She explained that creating this gift had been her way of expressing gratitude for his kindness and concern during a difficult time in her employment at the castle. George was deeply moved by Maria's gesture and by the thoughtfulness that had gone into creating something so personal and meaningful. He thanked her warmly and assured her that her hard work and positive attitude were valued by the entire royal family. This exchange exemplified for George the personal connections that could develop when people treated each other with genuine care and respect. During the reception, George also had the opportunity to speak with some of Thompson's colleagues in the security department. They shared with him how Thompson's transformation had positively influenced the entire security team, encouraging everyone to examine their own interactions with castle staff and to look for ways to be more collaborative and supportive in their approach to their responsibilities. One of the senior security officers explained to George that Thompson's experience had sparked valuable conversations within their department about how to maintain the highest security standards while also contributing positively to the castle's community atmosphere. These discussions had resulted in new protocols that emphasized both effectiveness and respect in all interactions with staff members and visitors. As the reception continued, George found himself in conversation with Mrs. Patterson about the long-term lessons that could be drawn from recent events. The experienced cook emphasized that lasting change required ongoing attention and commitment, not just a single moment of recognition or reform. She explained that creating a truly positive workplace culture was an ongoing process that required everyone to remain mindful of how their actions affected others. Mrs. Patterson also shared her observations about how George's involvement had influenced other young people in the castle community. She mentioned that some of the junior staff members had been inspired by George's example to speak up when they witnessed problems or to take initiative in creating positive changes in their own areas of responsibility. Later that evening, George joined his family for dinner, and the conversation naturally turned to the staff meeting and its significance. Prince William and Catherine expressed their pride in how George had handled the entire situation, from his initial observations through the collaborative approach to finding solutions. They emphasized that his actions had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership qualities that would serve him well throughout his life. Queen Elizabeth, who was also present for the family dinner, reflected on how the experience had provided valuable lessons for everyone involved. She explained that the most effective leaders were often those who could identify problems early, approach them with wisdom and compassion, and work toward solutions that strengthened rather than divided communities. The Queen also noted that George's gentle yet strong approach had been particularly effective because it had focused on helping people become better versions of themselves rather than simply punishing them for their mistakes. This approach had created lasting positive change and had strengthened the bonds within the castle community, rather than creating resentment or division. As the evening concluded, George felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the role he had played in improving life at Windsor Castle for so many people. He had learned that sometimes the most important actions are those that happen quietly, behind the scenes, focused on helping others rather than gaining recognition or praise for oneself. The experience had also taught George that effective leadership often requires patience, observation, and the courage to act on one's convictions even when the path forward isn't completely clear. He had discovered that his gentle approach, guided by the values his family had taught him, could create powerful, positive changes in the lives of many people. 6 months had passed since the transformative events that had begun with George's simple observation of staff members seeming unhappy at Windsor Castle. As spring returned to the castle grounds, bringing new life to the gardens and a sense of renewal to everyone who lived and worked there, George often reflected on the profound lessons he had learned and the lasting changes that had resulted from his gentle intervention. Thompson had become not just an effective security guard, but a beloved member of the castle community. His transformation had been so complete and genuine that many newer staff members found it difficult to believe that he had ever been anything other than the kind, respectful colleague they now knew. George took particular pleasure in observing Thompson's interactions with visitors to the castle, where his warm professionalism created positive first impressions that reflected, well, on the entire royal household. The relationship between Thompson and Maria had evolved into a genuine friendship that exemplified the spirit of mutual respect and support that now characterized the castle workplace. George often saw them chatting during break times, with Thompson taking interest in Maria's family back in Spain, and Maria sharing her perspectives on adapting to life in England. Their friendship had become a symbol of how meaningful relationships could develop when people approached each other with openness and kindness. George had also maintained his connection with both Thompson and Maria, checking in regularly with them and other staff members to ensure that the positive changes were being sustained. These ongoing relationships had enriched George's understanding of the diverse backgrounds and experiences of the people who worked at the castle, broadening his perspective on life beyond the royal family's immediate circle. The success of George's intervention had led to the establishment of regular meetings, where staff members could share concerns and suggestions in a structured, supportive environment. Queen Elizabeth had instituted these sessions based on the recognition that creating formal channels for communication was essential for maintaining the positive workplace culture that had been achieved. George was occasionally invited to participate in these meetings, providing him with ongoing opportunities to learn about leadership and community building. During one particularly memorable staff meeting, George was asked to share his thoughts about what had made the transformation at the castle so successful. He spoke about the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect, regardless of their position or status, and emphasized that creating positive change often required patience and understanding rather than confrontation or punishment. George's presentation to the staff was received with enthusiasm and appreciation, and many people commented afterward on how impressed they were by his wisdom and maturity. The experience of speaking to the group had been somewhat nerve-wracking for George, but it had also been deeply rewarding to see how his words resonated with people and contributed to their sense of being valued and heard. The positive changes at Windsor Castle had also attracted attention from other royal residences, where staff members had heard about the improvements in workplace culture and the role that gentle leadership had played in achieving them. George had been invited to visit Buckingham Palace to share his experiences with staff members there, providing him with his first opportunity to apply his leadership lessons in a different environment. The visit to Buckingham Palace had been both educational and inspiring for George. He had discovered that the principles he had learned about compassionate leadership were universally applicable, regardless of the specific setting or circumstances. The enthusiastic response he received from the Buckingham Palace staff had reinforced his understanding that people everywhere appreciated being treated with kindness and respect. Queen Elizabeth had used George's success as a teaching opportunity not just for him, but for other young members of the royal family as well. Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis had begun to show more interest in the people who worked around them, inspired by their brother's example to notice and care about the well-being of others. This ripple effect had created an even more positive atmosphere throughout the royal household. The lessons George had learned through this experience had influenced his approach to all of his relationships and responsibilities. His tutors had noticed increased confidence and maturity in his schoolwork, particularly when dealing with subjects related to history, government, and social issues. His understanding of leadership principles had become more nuanced and practical, grounded in real experience rather than just theoretical knowledge. Prince William and Catherine had observed their son's growth with tremendous pride, recognizing that the experience had accelerated his development in ways that traditional education alone could never have achieved. They had begun to involve George in more family discussions about royal duties and responsibilities, confident that he was developing the wisdom and judgment necessary to handle increasingly complex challenges. As George looked toward the future, he carried with him the profound understanding that true strength often lies in gentleness, that effective leadership requires empathy and patience, and that small actions motivated by genuine concern for others can create transformative changes in people's lives. The young prince had learned that his position in the royal family came with opportunities and responsibilities to make positive differences in the world, one relationship and one act of kindness at a time. Thompson continued to serve as a powerful reminder to George that people have the capacity for growth and change when they are approached with understanding rather than judgment. Their ongoing relationship had taught George about forgiveness, second chances, and the importance of creating environments where people could learn from their mistakes and become better versions of themselves. The experience at Windsor Castle had established patterns and principles that would guide George throughout his life as a member of the royal family. He had learned that paying attention to the well-being of others, approaching problems with wisdom and compassion, and working toward solutions that benefit everyone involved were not just noble ideals, but practical approaches that could create real positive change in the world. As spring blossomed around Windsor Castle, George felt a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons he had learned and the relationships he had built through this experience. He understood that his gentle yet strong action had not only helped Thompson and the castle staff, but had also shaped him into the kind of leader he wanted to become, someone who used his influence to protect and uplift others, creating communities where every person could thrive and contribute their best efforts toward shared goals.